The dawn of the 1960s was an age of contradiction. Humanity had split the atom, conquered the stratosphere, and stood on the edge of space, yet it lived in constant fear of total extinction. The Cold War was no longer just a political rivalry, it had become a psychological war for survival. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction hung over every conversation in Washington and Moscow like a thundercloud. The atomic age had matured into something far more terrifying, the thermonuclear age. It was no longer enough to threaten destruction. The new logic demanded that both sides prove they could annihilate the other at any moment, even if caught off guard. The United States, under the Strategic Air Command, SAC, was obsessed with this idea. At its head stood General Curtis LeMay, a man often described as brilliant, ruthless, and utterly without fear. LeMay believed that the only way to maintain peace was through absolute, visible readiness for war. He didn't trust ground-based missiles or static bombers that could be wiped out in a surprise attack. His answer was radical. Keep nuclear-armed bombers in the sky 24 hours a day, every day circling the globe in endless loops of deterrence. That plan became Operation Chrome Dome, a name that would come to define the madness and paranoia of the Cold War more perfectly than any other. Launched in 1960, Operation Chrome Dome was simple in concept, but staggering in execution. Dozens of B-52 Stratofortress bombers, each carrying multiple thermonuclear bombs, were assigned continuous airborne patrol routes across the Northern Hemisphere. At any given moment, American nuclear weapons were literally in the sky, orbiting the Soviet Union like vultures waiting to strike. The idea was horrifyingly elegant. If the Soviet Union launched a surprise attack and destroyed American bases, the airborne bombers would still be aloft, ready to counterattack within minutes. It was deterrence turned into a permanent, living mechanism, a sword that never left its sheath. But for the men who flew these missions, it was like living on the edge of hell. Each B-52 carried between 1 and 4 hydrogen bombs, often including the Mark 28 and Mark 39 warheads, with yields reaching several megatons each. A single plane had the destructive power to erase entire nations. Crews of 6 to 8 men were assigned to missions lasting 24 hours or longer, operating in total radio silence while skirting the borders of Soviet radar coverage. They flew at altitudes above 30,000 feet, refueled midair by KC-135 stratotankers, and endured freezing temperatures, fatigue, and the constant awareness that one mistake could mean the end of the world. "We were flying with Armageddon under our wings," one veteran later said. Every flight felt like history was holding its breath. To the outside world, Chrome Dome didn't exist. Officially, the program was classified as part of SAC's Reflex Alert readiness drills. But within the walls of Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, Chrome Dome was considered the ultimate insurance policy against nuclear surprise. Each bomber carried sealed envelopes, go codes, that would only be opened if communication with command was lost. Inside were coordinates for Soviet targets and attack routes. If Washington were destroyed, the airborne bombers would proceed to their assigned targets automatically. In theory, this ensured a second strike capability. In reality, it created the nightmare scenario of autonomous annihilation, machines and men continuing to wage nuclear war, even if civilization no longer existed. The scale of the Chrome Dome was breathtaking. At its peak, SAC maintained a rotating fleet of over a dozen nuclear-armed bombers in the air at all times, supported by hundreds of refueling tankers and thousands of maintenance and logistics personnel. Each mission consumed tens of thousands of gallons of jet fuel and required pinpoint coordination between air bases in the US, the UK, Spain, Greenland, and Alaska. It was a logistical ballet of madness, one that cost billions of dollars and rested on the assumption that human beings and machines could operate flawlessly forever. Inside the cockpits, the psychological toll was immense. The crew compartments were cramped, filled with the constant hum of engines and the metallic tang of recycled air. Pilots rotated between focus and delirium, dosing themselves with caffeine pills and black coffee to stay awake. The faint smell of hydraulic fluid and sweat became part of life. At 40,000 feet, fatigue blurred judgment, and the thought of what they carried began to gnaw at the edges of sanity. You never stopped thinking about it, another pilot recalled decades later. One wrong switch, one spark, and we'd vaporize half the world. But despite the danger, there was pride. Chrome Dome was considered elite duty, the pinnacle of SAC's discipline and precision. LeMay himself often visited air crews before missions, reminding them that they were the tip of the spear. His presence carried both awe and terror. To disobey or question him was unthinkable. He demanded perfection, and perfection meant treating the end of humanity as a routine possibility. Under his doctrine, hesitation was weakness, and fear was treason. The Air Force culture he built celebrated control, complete control over chaos. Yet the more they tried to master chaos, the closer they came to embodying it. By 1961, Chrome Dome had already logged thousands of flight hours without a major incident. SAC headquarters hailed it as proof of America's technological supremacy. But the statistics hid the truth. The bombers were aging, their systems prone to leaks, and the world below was holding its breath. Every mechanic, every radar operator, every pilot knew that one mistake could ignite the apocalypse. And as the 1960s began to unfold, with Berlin in crisis, Cuba on the brink, and nuclear arsenals growing by the month, the tension only grew tighter. The irony was brutal. The very operation meant to prevent nuclear war was slowly making it inevitable. Chrome Dome turned the nuclear arsenal into a permanent state of motion, erasing the boundary between readiness and recklessness. It created a machine too large to question, too dangerous to stop. As one historian later put it, it was deterrence with the safety off. The world didn't know it yet, but in just a few short years, that machine would begin to fall apart, literally. Before the decade was over, Chrome Dome would drop hydrogen bombs on friendly soil, scatter plutonium across oceans and ice, and nearly detonate a nuclear weapon in the heart of America. It would end not because leaders saw a reason, but because the sky itself became too dangerous to fly. By 1962, Operation Chrome Dome had evolved from an experiment in nuclear readiness into a way of life, a constant, unending ritual that consumed every waking hour of the men assigned to it. The mission briefings were clinical, the tone matter-of-fact. Yet every pilot, navigator, and gunner knew they were walking into something that defied sanity. Each Chrome Dome sortie began long before sunrise. Air crews gathered in dimly lit ready rooms, their flight suits zipped tight, their sidearms holstered, their eyes scanning the classified packets laid before them. They were told their route, their refueling points, their altitude, their code words, and sealed inside the most ominous envelope of all, their nuclear strike coordinates, known only as the Go package. These envelopes were signed like sacred relics, carried under lock and key into the cockpit, and kept beside the pilots at all times. In the event of total communication loss, these papers would decide whether the world lived or died. Once the mission was underway, everything became mechanical. The B-52 Stratofortress was both magnificent and monstrous. A flying fortress the size of a commercial airliner, but stripped of comfort. Its thin aluminum walls barely held out the cold, and its engines screamed at frequencies that made conversation nearly impossible without an intercom. The cockpit was a claustrophobic cathedral of switches, gauges, and blinking lights, each one capable of unleashing forces that could erase civilization. The cruise day was divided into endless cycles of checklists and silence. Takeoff was routine, the heavy roar of the engines lifting millions of pounds of steel and fuel into the black sky. Once airborne, they began their long journey to the edges of Soviet radar range, routes that traced across the North Pole, the North Atlantic, or down toward the Mediterranean. The monotony was suffocating. Hours passed with nothing but the hum of machinery and the distant crackle of radio static. Sometimes the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the cockpit clock, each second carrying the weight of apocalypse deferred. Pilots developed rituals to maintain their sanity, counting stars, reciting the names of their families or tapping Morse code messages to each other on the control yokes when the radio was silent. Others buried their fear under humor, inventing grim nicknames for their planes: Widowmaker, the Flying Coffin, the Angel of Death. Every 8 hours, they rendezvoused with KC-135 refueling tankers high above the Atlantic or Arctic. The operation was delicate and dangerous, a ballet of precision performed at 30,000 feet. The B-52s would slow to 300 knots, the tanker descending slightly above them, a long metal boom extending like a mechanical umbilical cord. If the boom missed its target or snapped, fuel could ignite and turn both aircraft into fireballs. The airmen called it the moment of truth. Some prayed under their breath during the maneuver, knowing that one slip meant instant incineration. Others treated it like just another line item on their checklist. The line between professionalism and denial had blurred long ago. The isolation was almost unbearable. Crews sometimes spent 30 hours aloft with little sleep, sustained by coffee, amphetamines, and the sheer momentum of discipline. Conversations were sparse. Jokes faded into silence. The sound of the engines became a lullaby of doom. The navigator hunched over his radar scope, tracing faint green blips that marked the coastlines of Greenland or Norway. The radar operator adjusted dials to avoid triggering Soviet tracking stations, and the pilot kept one eye on the fuel gauge and the other on the horizon, watching for contrails that might belong to Soviet interceptors. They never forgot that their presence was a provocation, a visible reminder to the Kremlin that annihilation was only a few button presses away. In those long, suspended hours, the mind played tricks. Pilots reported hallucinations, phantom voices on the radio, flashes of light that seemed to dance on the clouds below. Some swore they could see faint glows in the dark sky, reflections of distant cities that might already be gone if war had started below them. There were no windows to the world, only instruments, coordinates, and orders. The B-52 crews lived in a perpetual limbo between peace and Armageddon, between routine and apocalypse. They were trained to function without emotion, to suppress the human instinct that would question the morality of what they carried. Inside each bomber sat not just bombs, but the end of human civilization neatly packaged in steel casings. Yet to SAC, these flights were the pinnacle of discipline, a perfect marriage of machine and man. The men who flew them became a new kind of soldier, priests of annihilation, worshiping at the altar of readiness. Their daily life was ruled by precision, heart rate, altitude, airspeed, fuel consumption, all monitored to the decimal. There was no room for error, and yet error was everywhere. The fuel systems leaked, the oxygen lines froze, the instruments glitched under the cold. Each mission began with the assumption that something would fail. The only question was whether the failure would be survivable. SAC's response to every malfunction was the same: add more procedures, more layers of control, more rules to manage chaos. But chaos cannot be controlled forever. When they landed after a mission, the crews didn't celebrate. They walked off their planes in silence, faces pale and eyes hollow from fatigue. Ground personnel swarmed the aircraft like surgeons over a patient, checking for radiation leaks and mechanical stress. The bomb bay doors were locked, the warheads inspected, and the go packages returned unopened. The men were debriefed in sterile rooms, asked to report any deviations, as if a 20-hour brush with the apocalypse could be summarized in checkboxes. Some went home and slept for 2 days straight. Others sat in their cars staring at nothing, the roar of jet engines still echoing in their heads. Their families learned not to ask questions. Their children knew their fathers flew the big ones, but no one knew what that really meant. Behind the facade of calm efficiency, the cracks were deepening. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep the B-52s airborne, patching leaks, replacing parts, and praying the aging planes would hold together one more day. Every officer in SAC understood the numbers. Statistically, it was only a matter of time before one of these missions would end in fire. And yet, to question the mission was to invite career ruin. Chrome Dome was sacred doctrine. To suggest otherwise was heresy. General LeMay's philosophy still ruled from beyond his office. A culture of fear disguised as discipline, a religion where readiness was God and reason was sin. Inside SAC's Omaha Command Center, giant maps tracked the bomber routes like veins across a living world. Each glowing line represented megatons of nuclear fire, inching across the hemisphere in slow motion. Controllers monitored altitude, fuel status, and radio silence with the precision of surgeons. Above their heads, the phrase, "Peace is our profession," glowed in white letters across the wall, a grim reminder of what peace now required. Endless motion, endless threat, endless vigilance. The irony was suffocating. The system designed to prevent nuclear war had created a world where nuclear war was always seconds away. When President Kennedy took office, he inherited the full weight of Chrome Dome's invisible terror. The Berlin crisis, the Bay of Pigs, and later the Cuban Missile Crisis all unfolded with those bombers already in the air, loaded and waiting for the order that everyone hoped would never come. During the missile crisis in 1962, Chrome Dome crews flew at maximum readiness for 13 days straight, their go packages just inches from being opened. They slept in their seats, their fingers brushing against the bomb release switches as they dreamed of fire and silence. The closest calls of the Cold War weren't in missile silos or Kremlin war rooms. They were in those airborne coffins, circling the edge of human survival. By the end of 1962, Chrome Dome had flown over 12,000 missions without a single detonation, a fact SAC touted as proof of success. But beneath the triumph was a quiet horror. There had been dozens of near misses, fuel leaks, mid-air collisions narrowly avoided, hydraulic failures, and false radar warnings. The statistics told one story, the men told another. They had looked death in the face thousands of times, and each time they survived, command called it proof that the system worked. But every mechanic, every pilot, every navigator knew the truth. The system didn't work because it was safe, it worked because they had been lucky. And luck, as history was about to prove, always runs out. Luck in the nuclear age is not a strategy, but for 8 long years it was the only thing keeping humanity alive. Operation Chrome Dome had created an illusion of control so perfect that even its architects began to believe it. Every flight that returned to base without incident reinforced the myth that nuclear weapons could be managed with precision, that megatons of destruction could coexist peacefully with human error. But by the mid-1960s, the math had turned against them. Thousands of sorties, hundreds of millions of flight miles, and a fleet of aging bombers meant the question was no longer if something would go wrong, but when. And when it did, the consequences would echo for decades. The first real warning came in 1961 over Goldsboro, North Carolina. A B-52 Stratofortress on a routine Chrome Dome patrol developed a massive fuel leak shortly after takeoff. The pilot, Major Walter Tulloch, tried to return to base, but as the bomber descended through 10,000 feet, its right wing snapped clean off. The plane disintegrated in midair, scattering 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs over rural farmland. One bomb's parachute deployed and gently brought it to Earth. The other plunged nose first into the swampy soil below. When Air Force recovery teams arrived, they found something that froze their blood. Of the 4 separate safety mechanisms designed to prevent accidental detonation, 3 had already failed. Only a single low-voltage switch had kept the weapon from detonating with a force of 4 megatons, enough to wipe out everything from Washington, D.C. to New York City. Years later, the lead engineer on the recovery effort, Lieutenant Jack Revell, said bluntly, "By the slightest margin of chance, literally the failure of one switch, we avoided a thermonuclear explosion." The second bomb buried itself more than 20 feet deep, its uranium core unrecoverable. The government quietly sealed the area in concrete and posted radiation warnings that remain to this day. The official report called it a broken arrow, a nuclear weapon accident not expected to cause war. But to those who knew, it was proof that the United States had almost nuked itself before the Soviets ever fired a shot. The second disaster came 5 years later, and this time the entire world noticed. On January 17, 1966, a B-52 flying a Chrome Dome mission over the Mediterranean Sea collided with its refueling tanker during mid-air operations near the Spanish coast. The explosion was visible for miles. Both aircraft disintegrated instantly, killing 7 airmen and scattering 4 hydrogen bombs across the countryside of Palomares, Spain. 2 bombs hit the ground, their conventional triggers detonating on impact. The nuclear cores didn't explode, but the blasts spread plutonium dust across several square miles of farmland and village homes. The 3rd bomb landed intact in a dry riverbed, its parachute snagged on a tree. The 4th fell into the sea, vanishing into the depths. Within hours, the U.S. Air Force had cordoned off the area, and hundreds of radiation experts, soldiers, and intelligence officers descended on the scene under the codename Operation Moist Mop. A name as absurd as the mission was catastrophic. For months, teams worked to scrape contaminated soil, burn crops, and test civilians for exposure. Over 1,400 tons of radioactive dirt were packed into steel drums and shipped to South Carolina for burial. The missing bomb in the sea triggered a desperate international search involving submarines, sonar buoys, and divers. The Spanish government demanded answers while Soviet trawlers shadowed the recovery fleet, eager to find the weapon first. Finally, after 80 days, a U.S. submersible found the bomb resting upright on the seabed, its parachute tangled in coral. It was lifted to the surface with agonizing care, the crew praying the entire time that its safety's held. When it broke the waves, one diver whispered, "The devil just blinked." The Palomares disaster exposed what SAC had been hiding for years. The system wasn't fail-proof. It was a coin flip with civilization at stake. But the U.S. couldn't admit weakness. The Cold War was as much a war of perception as power. Chrome Dome flights resumed within days, though the crews now flew with quiet dread. They had seen what happened when the machine slipped, and they knew it would slip again. That moment came 2 years later, in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. January 21, 1968. A B-52G bomber took off from Plattsburgh Air Force Base in New York, bound for Thule Air Base, Greenland, as part of Chrome Dome's Arctic patrol circuit. On board were 4 hydrogen bombs. The mission was routine, the route familiar, but over Baffin Bay, the cabin heater malfunctioned, filling the cockpit with smoke. The crew tried to fight the fire, but it spread too quickly. With their instruments failing and visibility gone, the pilot turned toward Thule for an emergency landing. They never made it. At 3:39 p.m., the crew bailed out. 6 parachuted safely onto the ice. 1 was killed. Moments later, the plane hit the frozen sea and exploded in a blinding fireball. The high explosives in the bombs detonated, scattering uranium, plutonium, and tritium across miles of Arctic ice. The United States immediately declared another broken arrow. The cleanup, codenamed Operation Crested Ice, was one of the most dangerous missions ever attempted. For 6 months, American and Danish workers scraped radioactive ice, using bulldozers and shovels while their dosimeters screamed. The temperature was minus 40 degrees. Many would later develop radiation sickness and cancers, though few ever received compensation. The U.S. government quietly classified the full report for decades, claiming that no health effects were observed. It was a lie as cold as the ice they worked on. The Thule crash marked the breaking point. The political backlash in Denmark was immediate. Greenland, it turned out, had banned nuclear weapons on its soil, and now radioactive debris lay scattered across it. The Danish parliament demanded an end to Chrome Dome flights. European allies began to question whether American deterrence was worth the risk of contamination. Within the Pentagon, voices of dissent grew louder. The Air Force's own internal report admitted that maintaining nuclear weapons in constant motion was an unsustainable safety hazard. But Ahmed still refused to give up its skyborne vigil. LeMay's doctrine had outlived LeMay himself, and the men who inherited his empire were too afraid to dismantle it. In their eyes, to stop flying would be to admit that deterrence had been built on a lie. Yet the cracks were now impossible to hide. Each disaster revealed not just the danger of the bombers, but the absurdity of the system itself. The United States had nearly obliterated North Carolina, contaminated Spain, and poisoned Greenland, all in the name of safety. The Soviet Union, watching from afar, took note. Their intelligence analysts concluded that America's accidental readiness was both its strength and its weakness. A nuclear giant so obsessed with control that it might destroy itself trying to prove it. Behind closed doors, the CIA began tracking a classified category of events known as NUCFLASH, accidents that might trigger nuclear war. Chrome Dome had come perilously close to causing several. Soviet radar had misinterpreted bomber routes as possible attack vectors at least twice, prompting heightened alerts. American radar, in turn, had picked up false signals of Soviet launches during those same periods, almost resulting in a retaliatory order. The entire nuclear architecture had become a feedback loop of fear. For a few nights in the 1960s, civilization had hovered within minutes of extinction, and no one outside the military even knew. By the time the fires at Thule were extinguished, Chrome Dome was no longer a symbol of security, but a curse whispered among pilots. They called the flights death loops, suicide circuits, and the angels' routes. Every time a B-52 disappeared over the horizon, families wondered if it would come back. Every time a tanker refueled one mid-air, crews held their breath. And every time a broken arrow code was whispered over the radio, the men in command centers closed their eyes, praying the next one wouldn't make headlines or history. By the winter of 1968, the fire at Thule had melted more than ice. It had melted away the illusion that Operation Chrome Dome could last forever. The Air Force could no longer hide the cost of its obsession with airborne deterrence. Congress was furious, allies were terrified, and the American public, though still largely unaware of the program's existence, had begun to hear whispers of nuclear accidents overseas. Behind the polished walls of the Pentagon, the phrase continuous airborne alert turned from a badge of pride into a liability. The program had achieved its purpose. It had terrified the Soviets, reassured Washington, and proven that America could strike back under any circumstances. But it had also come dangerously close to proving that the United States could destroy itself without any help from Moscow. In secret meetings during February 1968, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and the Joint Chiefs quietly drafted an order to terminate Chrome Dome. The final decision wasn't made public, and no press release followed. The end came in the most Cold War way possible, quietly, bureaucratically, as if erasing a mistake by redacting a paragraph. The official explanation was a reallocation of strategic assets. But everyone in Strategic Air Command knew what it really meant. The machine had become too dangerous to operate. The bombers had done their job for 8 years, but their luck and the world's had run out. When the last Chrome Dome flight returned to base that March, there was no ceremony, no farewell. The crews simply taxied in, powered down their engines, and climbed out into the morning light. For the first time in nearly a decade, the sky above the northern hemisphere was empty of nuclear warheads in motion. It was like the world finally took a breath, one pilot remembered. Another described the silence as beautiful and terrifying. We didn't realize how loud it had been until it stopped. Inside SARC headquarters at Offutt Air Force Base, General Bruce Holloway, LeMay's successor, faced the grim task of unwinding his predecessor's legacy. Chrome Dome had been LeMay's masterpiece, a doctrine born from fear and perfected through obsession. To cancel it felt like sacrilege. But Holloway had numbers LeMay never did. By 1968, the B-52 fleet had accumulated over 35,000 nuclear sorties, consuming more than 200 million gallons of fuel and averaging one major mechanical failure per week. Safety incidents had quadrupled since the program began. Engineers warned that the constant flight cycles were tearing the planes apart. SAC's own safety board called Chrome Dome a sustained high-risk operation bordering on statistical inevitability. Holloway didn't need to be told what that meant. He had seen the photos: frozen craters in Greenland, scorched farms in Spain, half-buried bombs in Carolina soil. The age of airborne apocalypse was over. But while Chrome Dome ended, its philosophy of readiness did not. SAC simply moved its warheads from the sky to the ground. The same bombers were now kept on ground alert, parked at the edge of runways with crews sleeping nearby, ready to launch within 15 minutes. The ICBM fields across the Midwest expanded, and the Navy's new Polaris submarines began their endless patrols beneath the Arctic ice. The apocalypse no longer circled above. It lurked beneath oceans and inside silos. Chrome Dome had proven the psychological necessity of constant readiness, and the system adapted. The weapon changed shape. The fear remained. For the men who'd flown Chrome Dome, the program's end brought neither relief nor peace. Many couldn't let go of the rhythm of flight, the endless checklists, the vibration of engines, the certainty of duty. Without it, the silence of civilian life felt alien. Some spiraled into alcoholism, others withdrew completely. A few continued flying for SAC, but the mystique was gone. They were no longer gods in the sky. They were relics of a doctrine the world wanted to forget. "We used to think we were keeping the peace," one retired navigator said. "Now I think we were just keeping the apocalypse busy." Publicly, the Pentagon pretended Chrome Dome had never happened. There were no hearings, no apologies to Spain or Denmark, no memorials for the men who died in the air, or later from radiation exposure. The U.S. government quietly paid settlements through diplomatic channels, scrubbing every trace of the program from official records. Even the term broken arrow was reclassified under vague bureaucratic codes. But in the shadows, researchers and journalists began to dig. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, fragments of the story leaked, accident reports obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, declassified photographs of burned bomb casings, testimonies from veterans haunted by what they'd carried. By the time the full details of Palomares and Thule became public, the world was stunned. How could a superpower have played dice with Armageddon for so long? The answer lay in the psychology of the Cold War itself. Chrome Dome wasn't just a military operation. It was an ideological obsession. It embodied the belief that peace could only be guaranteed by proving a willingness to destroy everything. LeMay had once said, "If I see that the Russians are going to nuke us, I'll nuke them first." To him, Chrome Dome wasn't dangerous. It was logical. To cancel it was to admit fear, and fear was the one emotion SAC couldn't tolerate. But McNamara and the new generation of defense thinkers saw what he couldn't. Technology had outpaced control. Machines could no longer be trusted to obey the human hand forever. The end of Chrome Dome also exposed the fragile morality of deterrence. The same bombers that had once flown over the Arctic now sat grounded in desert boneyards, their aluminum skins gleaming under the sun. Visitors to those scrapyards saw nothing more than obsolete planes, unaware that each one had once carried the power to end civilization. The air crews who visited their old aircraft decades later described feeling both pride and horror. "We flew them with our hearts in our throat," said one gunner. "I loved that plane, but I hated what it meant." Inside nuclear strategy circles, Chrome Dome became a case study in how deterrence eats itself. It demonstrated that any system built on perpetual readiness inevitably moves toward catastrophe. The longer the bombers stayed aloft, the more likely disaster became. And yet, in its own twisted way, Chrome Dome succeeded. It terrified both sides into caution. Soviet intelligence had tracked the flights relentlessly, convinced that the U.S. might use a training mission as cover for a real strike. Kremlin reports declassified after the fall of the USSR revealed that the constant American presence in the skies pushed Moscow to maintain its own bombers on high alert, a state of paranoia that nearly led to several false alarms. In trying to make the world safe through fear, both sides only deepened their nightmares. By the 1970s, new crises replaced the old ones: Vietnam, Watergate, the arms race in space. But Chrome Dome's ghost remained. When nuclear treaties were signed in the following decades, the lessons of those airborne years haunted every clause. Safety mechanisms were redesigned, communication protocols improved, and fail-safe systems hardened. Each new rule carried the unspoken message, never again. Yet behind the reforms lurked a darker truth, that nothing had really changed. The weapons were still there, the doctrine still alive, and the same arrogance still whispered that control could last forever. When the last of the original Chrome Dome pilots gathered for reunions in the 1990s, their conversations always circled back to the same thought: how close they had come and how no one would ever know. "We flew with death every day," one said, "and the only reason anyone's alive to talk about it is because the wrong wire didn't cross." They laughed, but it was a hollow laugh. The laughter of men who understood that the machine they'd served hadn't been a guardian of peace, but a roulette wheel with atomic stakes. When Operation Chrome Dome finally vanished into the classified archives of the Cold War, it didn't die, it transformed. Its ghost still moved through every nuclear silo, submarine, and command center that remains on alert today. The world never truly abandoned the logic that created it. It merely buried the evidence under layers of modern control systems, digital safeguards, and official denial. Chrome Dome was supposed to be forgotten, yet its shadow stretches across decades of military doctrine, haunting every discussion about deterrence, automation, and the psychology of survival. It was more than an operation. It was a philosophy, one that believed safety could be achieved only by dancing on the edge of annihilation. Historians now look back on those years with a mixture of awe and horror. The sheer audacity of keeping thermonuclear weapons permanently in the air seems almost mythic, a relic from a time when the survival of civilization depended on the calm hands of exhausted pilots. And yet that myth was real. For nearly a decade, the United States lived one mechanical failure away from erasing itself. The men who participated in Chrome Dome weren't villains or lunatics. They were soldiers obeying orders crafted by strategists who thought they were saving the world. The tragedy is that their mission was built on a paradox. By preparing for total destruction, they guaranteed that destruction was always within reach. In the decades that followed, the lessons of Chrome Dome filtered into new generations of nuclear planning. The Strategic Air Command evolved into the U.S. Strategic Command. Its reach extended into cyberspace and orbital surveillance. The bombers that once circled the poles now rest in museums or desert graveyards. But the systems that replace them are faster, smarter, and just as capable of ending civilization in minutes. Submarines glide silently under the waves, carrying warheads that can flatten continents. Satellites detect missile launches in real time. Computers calculate retaliatory strikes faster than humans can think. To the casual observer, this seems like progress. Safer, more reliable, more controlled. But to those who understand the history, it's the same nightmare in a new form. The logic of Chrome Dome, constant vigilance, permanent readiness, and the illusion of perfect control never disappeared. It just became quieter, hidden behind algorithms instead of air crews. The legacy of Chrome Dome also lies in how it changed humanity's perception of power. Before the Cold War, war was something fought on battlefields. After Chrome Dome, war became something fought in the imagination, an abstract tension hanging over the globe, invisible yet omnipresent. The bombers that once roared through the stratosphere weren't just machines. They were symbols of an age where fear became infrastructure. They proved that the greatest weapon wasn't the bomb itself, but the constant reminder that the bomb existed. Every flight, every refueling operation, every mechanical checklist whispered the same truth. Peace had become a balancing act performed on a razor's edge. When veterans of the operation were finally allowed to speak publicly in the late 20th century, their testimonies stunned historians. They described moments of beauty mixed with terror, watching the aurora borealis shimmer over the Arctic while sitting atop 4 hydrogen bombs, or seeing the sun rise through the cockpit glass, knowing that if orders came, that sunrise might be the last on Earth. Many confessed that they hadn't fully understood the enormity of what they were doing until decades later. "We thought we were defending freedom," one pilot said. "Now I think we were defending the illusion of control." Another put it more simply: the bomb was God and we were its angels. The psychological cost of Chrome Dome is impossible to measure. Thousands of airmen carried the weight of that responsibility in silence. Some suffered nightmares, others numbness. A few became whistleblowers trying to expose the dangers they had witnessed, only to be silenced by security oaths. For every man who returned home safely, there were others who didn't, lost in accidents that could never be publicly acknowledged. Their names never appeared on monuments, their deaths hidden behind phrases like training mishap or mechanical failure. But in their absence, the message of Chrome Dome endured. The world had built a machine too powerful to fully comprehend, and for nearly a decade, it had trusted that machine to never make a mistake. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War seemed to end, many believed that humanity had finally escaped the shadow of nuclear terror. But the declassified documents that followed told a different story. They revealed that, between 1950 and 1980, the United States recorded over 1,000 significant nuclear accidents or incidents, many involving weapons fully armed and ready to detonate. Chrome Dome had been the most extreme manifestation of that insanity, but it was only part of a much larger truth. Nuclear deterrence had always been an act of faith disguised as science. The more the superpowers built, the more fragile their safety became. Today, the B-52 still flies. Modernized, refitted, its wings older than many of its pilots, it remains the only aircraft from that era still in active service. Some of the very planes that once flew Chrome Dome missions now participate in global strike command exercises. The weapons are different, but the purpose is the same: to remind rivals that the apocalypse is still ready, still waiting. And in that strange continuity lies the true legacy of Chrome Dome, proof that humanity never really learned to step away from the edge. The program didn't fail because it was reckless. It failed because it worked exactly as intended. It kept the world terrified and therefore restrained. It turned fear into policy and survival into an accident that repeated itself every day. The pilots who remain alive today are old men now, their hands trembling from age instead of turbulence. Some still visit the museums where their bombers are displayed, touching the cold fuselage and whispering memories to the ghosts inside. They remember the endless skies, the sound of engines that shook their bones, and the impossible burden of flying with the end of the world in their cargo bay. They also remember how ordinary it all felt after a while, how the apocalypse became routine, how humanity adapted to the absurd. One of them once said, standing beneath the towering wing of a B-52 on display, "It's beautiful, isn't it? And completely insane. But that's the world we made." Operation Chrome Dome remains one of the most haunting examples of how far human beings will go to feel safe. It was a triumph of engineering and a failure of imagination, a masterpiece of organization built on the assumption that nothing would ever go wrong. And yet for almost a decade, it worked, because no one dared to stop it. That is perhaps its most terrifying lesson, that survival in the nuclear age doesn't depend on brilliance, bravery, or strategy, but on restraint, humility, and luck. The men of Chrome Dome gave the world a decade of luck. The rest is up to us.